Hello and welcome to the Sitecore Print Experience Manager video series. This video is InDesign concepts for Sitecore developers. My name is Mark Demeny. I'm a technical consulting engineer with Sitecore's enablement services. I can be reached via email on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I blog regularly in the technical blog section on sitecore.net. The purpose of today's video is to educate Sitecore PXM developers in necessary aspects of InDesign. The audience is Sitecore developers who are building out complex PXM solutions. The agenda is as follows. First, we'll have a section on basic InDesign concepts and skills. Spend a few minutes in InDesign getting familiar with it as a software program and understanding how it relates to PXM. Second, we'll cover building out PXM projects and understand how these are stored within Sitecore and how these are worked with through the InDesign connector. Third, we'll work with master documents. These store the high-level style information for your print output. Fourth, we'll cover styles and how these are affected within PXM projects. Fifth, we'll cover off flows. These are ways of working with dynamic variable length publications and outputting that content to print. Lastly, we'll discuss document structure. This is important for when you're working with contents and documents that may alter the actual layout of a page. The ability to use many of the InDesign concepts for expanding and collapsing text frames are important when dealing with dynamic content. So, we're going to spend some time at the beginning of this video covering off basic InDesign concepts and skills. First and foremost, what is InDesign? InDesign is a program used by graphic designers, primarily working heavily in print. It's used commonly for things like books, magazines, brochures, one-pagers, etc., etc. Let's spend a few minutes getting familiar with the interface. We have a brochure here for a fictitious airline called Jetstream. We can see here this brochure has 4 pages. Cover page, 2 intro or middle pages, and the final page. Common elements that you use within InDesign. Most of your design and document editing tools are on the left-hand side of the page. This is where you can create things like text frames, place images, do gradients, things like this line art here, edit text. All of these content editing tools here are on the left. On the right-hand side of your screen, common tools are editing the pages. You can see here, again, these are the 4 pages that we have. Layers. Layers are important for keeping track of where content is structured on a page. You'll note here that looking at this document, we have different layers in different colors. These correspond to the colors that you see here. You can show and hide layers. It's another very common activity. Paragraph styles and character styles. These are preset styles that you can use and reuse in multiple places. So for example here, by selecting this text here, you can see that this is the H4 style. I can edit that and I can see the text and the font that's being used. Character styles are similar to paragraph styles, except they apply primarily to individual characters. So things like making characters bold or italics. One nice thing or interesting thing about the InDesign interface is that you can really customize it to how you work on a regular basis. Page elements can be pulled off, they can be snapped back in place. You can see here that I have some of the Sitecore icons for the InDesign connector installed. If I click on these then fly out. We'll be working with a lot of these a lot more in the next few minutes. All right, we'll now spend a few minutes going through the most commonly used InDesign elements. The first and most obvious one is a text frame. Any text that you see on a printed page has to exist within a text frame. Secondly, image frames and images. Now, image frames and images are a little bit different compared to HTML. one of the interesting aspects of InDesign is that you can have an image frame that is basically like a crop on top of the image. And these two exist as separate concepts within InDesign. And this means you can move and manipulate the image frame independently of the image underneath it. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Lastly is inline and anchored elements. These are basically ways to do relative text placement within a text frame of other text frames. Lastly, we'll look at tables, and then we'll look at some of the other InDesign elements that Print Experience Manager also supports within Sitecore. So if we look back here at our document, we can start experimenting and looking at how some of these are used. By working with the selection tool, you can see here a text frame. Now, a text frame, unlike HTML and InDesign, uses absolute positioning. So you have a specific X and Y coordinate, you have a specific width and height. You can see here by shortening this text frame, the text then flows within that in a longer fashion. If I make the text frame too small, you see an indication of a little plus sign. This indicates what we call overset text. That is to say that the text that you have within the text frame is longer than the text frame itself. This shows up here on the page in this little plus. It also shows up on the bottom of the screen in what InDesign calls a preflight. So you can see here that I have 11 errors. If I make this text frame bigger, it rechecks. This goes back down to 10 errors. Secondly is images and image frames. I mentioned earlier that these are two separate concepts within InDesign, and here's an image that you can see here. Next in importance is images and image frames. If we look here in our document, we can see a number of images on this page. If I look at this image, for example, and select it, you can see two sets of editing. The first is editing the image frame itself. So I can squeeze this in and make the frame bigger or smaller. Secondly, I can select the image within that frame. By selecting this little bullseye here, you can now see that the image itself is actually much larger than the frame that we're displaying on that page. I can then drag this down and I can make it bigger or smaller. I can crop it appropriately and use all those other tools on the page. This is a very important concept within InDesign. This means that you can use often one single underlying image, and you can have image frames in multiple locations, cropping that appropriately for each usage. Next, we have what we call anchored elements. Anchored elements are very important within text frames, and they're even more important within flows, because then all of your positioning is relative instead of absolute. We can see it here in this document. If we look at these ratings, by clicking on it, you can see a little picture of an anchor. That indicates that that's an anchored element. Now, why is this important or useful? Well, if we look at these hotels here versus the five-star hotel, the Hotel Galleria, you'll see that the star is right justified, meaning that it is aligned to the right of this text frame. Now, the minute that three-star or two-star hotel becomes a three-star hotel, another star is added and things start shifting leftwards. So these are anchored elements which are set to be positioned relative to other anchored elements. And so this means that in a three-star hotel, everything is right aligned. A five-star hotel, everything is right aligned. And this is a very common method, first of all, within InDesign, but of course within PXM as well. It means that you can use elements and start doing relative positioning, whereas InDesign in general, by default, is usually positioning text using absolute positioning. Another very common element is that of the table. In InDesign, it serves much the same purpose as it does within HTML. That is namely the ability to make a table and place elements within that. You can see here, if we look at our hotel, the Palazzo Bembo, for the ratings and the cost, I have a one-row, two-cell table here. I can double-click into that, and I can go to Table, Table Options, and Table Setup, and you can see here that, in fact, this is a one-row, two-column table. Of course, those are just the commonly used elements. If you look in the templates list within Print Experience Manager, you can see the publishing engine supports a number of other elements: paths, polygons, rectangles, sticky notes, etc., etc. And lastly, towards the end of this, we'll cover doing customized elements for elements that PXM may not necessarily support out of the box, or particular renderings that PXM may not support out of the box. On SDM, there's a publishing engine reference manual that outlines all of the potential customizations that we can do. Okay, so we now have a basic understanding of InDesign. Well, second, what's a PXM project? So here we'll go through a PXM project overview and look at the InDesign elements stored within Sitecore. Okay, so now we're actually going to use the Sitecore InDesign connector. You can see here that I've opened up the Libraries tab, and this gives me a list of my Print Studio projects. I'm not going to spend too much time showing you the details of a project or showing you how to build one. There's going to be another video for that. However, I do want to go through some of the basic elements, and so you can understand how elements within a PXM project relate to the elements on the InDesign page. I'm going to take this Jetstream brochure project and drag and drop this over to my working project. You can see this tab here. Next, I'll press the Load the Current Item button. What this is doing now is the connector is talking to Sitecore over web services, and it's making a request to get all of that content and build that document and display it here within the client window. So you can see here within my project, I have a number of pages, and I can double click on those pages and I can be brought to that page within the working document. So project structure very much matches the document structure within InDesign. I have a book, I have documents, within a document I have pages, and within a page I have elements. So I'm going to concentrate a little bit on the first page here. So we can see here that we have some page objects. We have a text frame here. Again, by double clicking on that, the screen centers to that text frame. I can look here on my title, and again that title is Venice, Italy. I can look at my subtitle. I can look at the city indicator, and what that city indicator is, you can see by this icon, that's actually a path. We didn't spend too much time on that because it's not one of the important elements, but you can see that path is that triangle showing where Venice is on the map of the world. And then lastly, we can see this image frame and the image within that image frame. So that's really that cropping of the image that we saw before. So that's what a PXM project is. Simply put, it's an InDesign document stored within Sitecore as separate content items. Well, the fact that they're separate content items actually opens up a number of benefits. The first and foremost is the ability to relate this content to Sitecore content. If I look here at the Sitecore content tree, you can see here that this content is showing me Venice. I'm going to go through and I'm going to pick some Milan content, and by dragging and dropping that over, all of this content that was referring to Venice content is now referring to Milan. I've got a different Milan-based title, I've got a different Milan-based subtitle, I have an image of Milan in the background, and all of that is enabled by the fact that this Sitecore layout item is actually underneath the hood referring to a different Sitecore content item to actually get the content. That's kind of the first benefit. And the second benefit is you can do a lot of customizations, such as the city indicator, and swapping that out and doing things like transforming text and doing customizations on an element by element level. That's also enabled by the fact that these are elements within Sitecore. The last thing is the fact that these are Sitecore content items makes it very easy to manipulate a document programmatically. I can add new pages as necessary. I can have workflow permissions. I can have user permissions. All of these things are enabled by that. Now, of course, the obvious developer or designer is going to look at this and say, well, that's a lot of elements instead of a single InDesign document. And that's true. However, one of the really nice things about PXM is simply by dragging and dropping, you can open an existing document and drag and drop content and build out a PXM project. There'll be another video on that. The last thing is, for very large documents, the ability to work on an element by element basis is crucial for performance. A lot of customers working with very large brochures and very large designs will often take a document and break it up into a number of smaller documents simply because the whole document is too large to actually load in one time in one context. One of the nice things about PXM is you can say, right, I just want to go and edit page 2. And you can see that that loads. It's here, created me a PDF of page 2, so I can preview that. But that means that you can edit that. You see I tried to load page 1. Well, it doesn't exist. And so by focusing and by breaking this document up into smaller chunks, it means that you can then edit and work with those smaller chunks without necessarily stepping on other people's toes. You can work on one large document simultaneously with people working on individual portions. But secondly, for large documents, just from a size perspective, dealing with large images, it means that you can work with smaller bits of that information, which is much better for performance reasons. All right, so the next section that we're going to cover are master documents. And the purpose of a master document within a PXM project is really somewhat similar to a layout and sub-layouts within a Sitecore web project. It's really controlling a lot of the base layout and styling information. We'll spend a few minutes within InDesign covering this. So if we go back to our document that we were working with a little bit earlier, let's close our Sitecore tabs and look at the Pages tab. Now, within a master, you have this concept of spreads. And a spread is somewhat like a sub-layout. So while the master controls a lot of the things like the character styles and paragraph styles, which is similar to CSS in the HTML world, a spread is somewhat like a sub-layout. So we can see here I have 3 spreads. I have what we call the A front spread, the B master spread, and the C last spread. Spreads, as you create them, are automatically given letter references. These are used in references elsewhere within the document, and they're automatically created. Now you can see here, by looking at this spread, it's basically a lot of the background information that's occurring on every page that uses that spread. So you can see why I compare these somewhat to sub-layouts and layouts within Sitecore. Now I'm going to close this project that we were working with earlier, and I'm going to go to the Libraries tab and look at the master documents and load this Jetstream brochure master. So now if I look at the pages, you can see I only have my spreads. I don't have any of the page information which was created and loaded by the PXM project. It really is just the core design information. So master document contains, first and foremost, the spreads. So I have my different page layouts that you can use within that document. Secondly, master document consists of paragraph styles and character styles and other styles, object styles, table styles, etc., etc. The primary ones you're worried about are paragraph styles and character styles. These are important because styles are something that PXM uses very much like CSS classes. In the same way that you don't want to be doing overrides left and right in an HTML document, you don't want to be using deprecated fonts, you don't want to be using rich text on a regular basis, you really want to be using set CSS classes. Character styles and paragraph styles are exactly that equivalent in InDesign. And in fact, later on within this video, we'll be looking at how to transform and map paragraph styles with CSS classes and HTML elements within PXM. So, object styles as well, it stores within the document. And this is something that is actually stored in Sitecore, in the media library, as a file, as a blob object. Every PXM project has to be related to a master document because the master document is necessary for all of that styling information to be shown and used. Okay, the next 2 topics we're going to cover are quite interrelated. These are styles and text handling. And so what I'm going to do is go through styles very quickly, and then as we go through text handling, I think the importance will become more clear, and particularly as we look at transformations within PXM. And so in brief, a character style is really something like character information that is not applying to an entire paragraph. So it's little accents on characters, bold, italics, those sort of minor transformations that are just on a character by character basis. A paragraph style is a style that's applied to an entire paragraph. And so you can think of this as analogous to using CSS classes. Now, transformations are really the act of configuring Print Experience Manager to map CSS classes and HTML elements to both character styles and paragraph styles. And so we'll look into that. And so as we take a look at styling, we're also going to take a look at text handling and how different types of text elements are handled by PXM, and in particular, which ones use the transformation engine. So we'll start going through these now. Let's switch back over to InDesign. Okay, so we're now back here in InDesign, and you can see here that without a document loaded, I have no paragraph styles or character styles. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to load a master document. In this case, we're going to use the master document that's associated with the Jetstream brochure. I don't really want to be working with a PXM project just yet. I just want to be looking at the character styles and the paragraph styles that are associated with this master document. So now if I click on the paragraph styles, you can see that where before it was blank, I now have a whole list of styles. And if we think back to the document that we saw earlier, and in particular some of the ratings, we have styles for a lot of the elements that we saw earlier. We have styles for some of the progress indicator, star ratings, cell ratings for that table that we were seeing earlier, and we have character styles for those things that I was talking about earlier. If we see a hyperlink, we want that applied as a particular character style, so it looks blue on the page, since that's familiar to a lot of people as a hyperlink. Similarly, we have an italic and a bold style. So this is really all the paragraph and character style information that is associated with this document. And so we'll now start looking at a few text elements, and in particular, how those are handled within Sitecore. Okay, so now that we understand the basics of the character styles and paragraph styles within this document, what we're going to do is very quickly create a new PXM project, and that way we can look back at text handling and see how text is handled within different elements within that project. So first, I'm going to go to the Libraries tab, I'm going to go to Print Studio Projects, and I'm going to make a new project. And I'll call this InDesign Basics. And again, I don't see my project tab, I'd close that. So I'm going to make a new one, and I'm going to drag and drop InDesign Basics over, create a new document, and a new page. I'm doing this very quickly because there's actually going to be video series that will show how to do this in much more detail. And more importantly, the project that we're doing here is going to be very, very simple. So I've created that project. I'm going to assign this Jetstream brochure as the master. I'm going to close this, and I'm now working in the context of a project. Okay, so now that we have this project created, we're going to go through the 4 different text types that you see here, and in particular how styles are handled for each of those. So let's start with the single line text and the rich text. These actually come from Sitecore content items. So what we'll do is we'll go through the content tree, find a single line text box and a rich text box, and drag and drop them onto the page. So what I'm going to do is go to the Content tab, and if you aren't already there, navigate down to the Print Media section, and I'm looking at my Venice content item. Now here in the lower part of this screen, I can see all the fields associated with that content item. So earlier I changed about long to be a rich text field. Previously it was a multi-line field. It wasn't actually used for anything in the project. And so now I can drag and drop that over as rich text, and we'll position that on the page. Similarly, for the About City title, you can see here it has a box with an S, that's single line text. A box with an M, that is multi-line text. And for the purposes of PXM, those are both handled somewhat identically. And you can see About Long here shows a bit more of a complex interface. It shows, it's very tiny And you can't really see it, but it's basically showing, what is rich text. And you can have elements and images and tables and all sorts of that stuff in that rich text displayed on the page. So I have my rich text here, and I'm going to drag the About City title. And so this says About Venice, and that is my single line text. Now, I'm going to add those to a PXM project so we can see what's actually going on in the background. I'm going to select both of those and drag and drop that to the page. And what happens here is PXM creates a new snippet and adds those as elements, as text frame elements within that snippet. And so now we can go to Sitecore and see what's actually being stored in that item behind the scenes. Okay, so here we are in Sitecore looking at the Print Studio project that I just created. And you can see here I have my snippet and I have my About City title and I have my rich text here. Now I'm looking at the About City title item, and you can see a lot of elements related to that item. And a few things here that are pretty important for later concepts is this item has a renderer on it. This item is pointing to some Sitecore content underneath it. It's not a static text item. We'll mention it's static text in a minute. And lastly, what I'm really concerned with here is my paragraph style. So you can see here that I have the paragraph style of body. Now, back to InDesign. So if I select this text here and I go to my paragraph styles, you can see that the paragraph style of body is selected. Those two things correspond with each other. So now if I change this to an H1, and that is white, and I don't want white on white, so I'm going to move that up there, and I'm going to save this element here. And I'm not going to save the content because the content is actually the underlying content in the Sitecore content item, really the text that says About Venice. I haven't made any change to that item. I've only made a change to the layout, and that's really what I'm saving back to my PXM project. So if I say OK to that and I go back to my PXM project and refresh this, you can see that my paragraph style now says H1, and that is exactly what I had selected here in my paragraph styles. And so a single line text basically has a single paragraph style applied to the entire text frame. You can't use overrides within that, and an override is really the ability to take particular character elements within this and change those and do minor tweaks to that you would normally do in InDesign. And the reason why you can't do overrides kind of makes sense for Sitecore in general, and it's the same reason for in a single line text item in Sitecore for web, you can't store any formatting information, and same for PXM, you can't store any formatting information. So if I go back here, what's actually happening is my About City title on this Venice content item, I'm going to open that up. This is what's being stored. It's a single line text field. It doesn't have the ability to store formatting information. But what PXM does do is for that field, it has the ability to overlay that paragraph style on top of it. And so that's how single line text is handled. And single line text is just like single line text for Sitecore for the web. You're using it for things like titles, subtitles, stuff that you're going to reuse on index pages, things where you really specifically don't want to have formatting, because that information can be used in multiple contexts. Now we're going to look at rich text. If we look at the field here that I dragged earlier, this is a rich text field. Now I'm going to edit this in two parts. First, this was coming from a multi-line text field, which actually had no formatting. So I'm going to need to go back to the original Sitecore content item and apply some formatting. And then we're going to see the effect the formatting has in the document. And then we're going to look at the transformation engine and edit that in order to obtain transformation set mappings. So if we go back to the document here, I'm going to do a few things. First, I'm going to make this an H1. I'm going to make this italic. I'm going to make this bold. And I'm going to link this to another Sitecore content item. And I will save that change. So if we go back to InDesign here and we reload the document, we're going to see a few changes in place. Now the first is there's a couple things that PXM is doing as simple overrides. So if we look at this italic text here, we can see this plus sign on a character style, and that's what an override is. It's basically the ability to apply some minor formatting text changes. This is same for bold, and we can see here that if I select my H1, it's actually made a paragraph style called H1. And this paragraph style didn't exist before in our master document. And so what PXM is doing, it is automatically creating a paragraph style. And the reason it does that is that every paragraph needs to have a paragraph style. It can't be without one. So in the case of not having one that exists, it actually creates one. And this was done by the transformation mapping engine by default. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go back to the transformation engine and start doing some changes to that so that we can get this document to really look the way that we want it. In this case here, we want this to be an H4, and we want this to actually be using the character style of italic. And the reason is the character style actually uses a slightly different color. And again, we want this to be the character style of bold. That's really what we want to have happen. And bold, you can see, changes the color entirely. So we don't want to be using overrides. We want to be using proper character styles. So I'm going to blast this away by simply reloading that page. It reverts to the way it was before. And I'm going to open up Sitecore and take a look here at the transformation engine. Now, we saw earlier back in our document here that the ahref was converted to the character style of bold. And how and why was that done? Well, the Jetstream examples have a character style mapping already. So I can look down here and say, this is the A character style. So it's taking the XHTML element of an anchor, and it is converting it to the XML element of a character style. And similarly, it is applying the character style of bold. That is really pretty straightforward. So that one is being done automatically as part of the Jetstream example. So we want to do the same for our EM tags and our strong tags. So let's go again back to our original document here and look at the editor and look at the HTML. So we can see, right, our ahref is being transformed. Great, that's exactly what we want. But we have an EM emphasis tag and we have a strong tag. And so we want to convert those. And similarly, we want to convert the H1 character to actually use a paragraph style called H4. So let's go back here to our out-of-the-box definitions. We have one for H1. And so again, what it's doing is it's taking the H1 XHTML element and making a paragraph style of, with the attribute of heading 1. That's exactly how this heading 1 was created. But we don't want to use that. We want this to be H4. And so it's a bit confusing. Our H1 in HTML, I'm actually going to make a paragraph style called H4. The reason is we can say, right, if something is really bold on the page, we want to keep it using a style that makes sense on the page. The H1 is just for headers on black backgrounds. So I'm going to change this to H4 and hit save. So back to InDesign. If I reload this, you can now see that I'm using the H4. This has a sort of peach background. The reason is that I don't have the font that this is being used in this particular case. I'm not overly concerned with that for this demo, but if you're wondering what that is, that's what that means. So our transformation is working there. Next, I'll concentrate on the italics and the bold because I don't want those to be overrides. I actually want to use the character styles of italics and bold. So here, I want to change this to italic, and I want to remove this class element. That's what it's looking for. It's looking for a class value. I'm not converting a class. I'm actually converting an HTML element, so I'm going to remove that class element. Same thing for here. I'm going to call this, instead of character style 1, I'm going to call this bold. And again, I'm going to remove that class definition that it's looking for, and I'm going to save that. So now, same content, I haven't changed, I've just changed the transformation engine settings. I load this current item, and now you can see that this italics actually uses the character style of italics. And this bold actually uses the character style of bold. It's no longer using overrides to achieve that text. And that's really what the transformation engine is. It's an ability to assign CSS and HTML elements to specific character styles and paragraph styles within InDesign. Now the obvious question is, well, I might have different sites or subsites within Sitecore, and similarly I might have different documents that I'm printing out that have completely different style sets. I'm not going to get too much into the details, but suffice to say, you can make different transformation sets, which can have different elements and definitions within that set. And those in turn can be assigned to a master document. So if we go up to my Jetstream brochure master document, you can see that it is using that Jetstream transformation set. That's how it had that original hyperlink being transformed, because that transformation set was assigned to that brochure. And so it does give you the ability to have different mappings and transformations for different styles and master documents within InDesign. Now, for our next item, I want to talk about static text. And static text is really a text item that only belongs to this document and project. Unlike this single line text or this rich text that can be shared between multiple documents and shared between print and web, static text is only used in the content of this document individually. And it has a couple advantages and a couple disadvantages. The disadvantage being, obviously, it's much more difficult to share it, it's much more difficult to translate it. But the advantage is that you can throw whatever you want in that static text. You can do a lot of formatting, you can do kerning, you can do overrides. Really, whatever you put in the static text is stored as it is. It's not transformed, it's not stripping out styles in any way. So I can add some text here. And I'm going to do a few things. So I'll take this and I'll skew it 30%. And I'll take this and I will make this a different style. And if I want to add this static text to my PXM project, I can just drag it over to that snippet. And you can see here that unlike the previous two items, here I have this relating to a Sitecore content item, a particular item and field. Same with this one. This text frame doesn't have that. And what it does have is a child item that stores the XML that represents the text on that page. So if I go back to Sitecore here and I refresh this, you can see here that all of this is XML, and it's basically all the paragraph styles and all the overrides, and you can see that skew value here stored in that XML for this bit of text. And this is why I say, technically speaking, this can be translated, but in practice, it's very difficult to extract out the information or the content, I should say, from the formatting. And so for this reason, static text also is not ideal in cases where you want to translate text. If you want to translate text, obviously, you should be pointing to Sitecore content items where you can go through a typical translation process workflow. Now, lastly, on the subject of text handling, I want to talk about text in master documents. If we look at our master document for this Jetstream project, you can actually see here that we have some text on the page that says, to book your trip, visit jetstream.com/trip planner. Now, this text, because it's in the master document, has many limitations. It can't be shared, it can't be translated, it's basically baked into every document that uses this page. So if I was to make a page 2 here, so I'm going to insert 2 pages and use this B master, you're going to see here on page 2 and 3 that it has that text. And you'll also see that I can't select it easily. This is baked into the master document. There's a lot of limitations. Now, that said, it's important to know about text handling in master documents for one subject, and that is that of variables. So if we think back to our Jetstream example and you're booking a trip to Venice or Milan, let's say we want to insert that text to say to book your trip package to, and we want to have a city in there. So it would say to Venice or to Milan. In that case, you can use InDesign variables. Now, this is worthy of a video and a blog posting itself. I'm not going to cover off the entire topic, but just suffice to say that you can do this, and I'll demonstrate it very quickly to at least show you how to define a variable. So the first is under type, you have text variables, and I want to define a new variable, and I will say new, and this variable I'm going to call it $city, and this is custom text, and right now the text is nothing. I'm just going to say Venice for that matter, and you'll see the output preview of Venice. So I will say done, and now here I can insert that by saying insert text variable of city, and you'll see the output there says Venice. So the point of all this now is now we have a variable called $city, and that is something that we can easily feed data to using PXM. So when this project is created, we can update that variable and pass that value of Venice or pass that value of Milan. This is really important for things like headers, running headers, page numbering, titling, things like that. So as you're iterating through and building out your PXM project, you can be passing variables to the master document. And that is probably the only time that you want to be using text in a master document. Even this text here to book your trip package to Venice, that's something ideally you want related to a Sitecore content item. So you can translate that, so you can update that. These are things right now, if we're to update that, we need to go to a graphic designer and say, pull down the master, make that change, send it back. Well, how do we translate that? Well, it's buried deep within an InDesign document. It's very complicated. So you want to avoid having text in master documents, ideally reserving it for things like headers, running headers, titles, page numbering, things like that. And if you do need to pass variables to that, you can do it using the variable functionality with InDesign and in combination with PXM. For examples on variable usage, visit SDN and look at the solution cases and look at the Jetstream price list. We've been looking at the brochure in these examples, but the Jetstream price list has updating headers for updating text within the master document. And so that's it for text handling and styling. All right, for our next topic, we're going to talk about flows, namely what are they and why are they necessary. So we're going to do this in two parts. For the first part, I will actually show a demonstration of what a flow is, and then for the second part, we'll set about building one. And what a flow is basically it's a what we call variable length document, and that is to say we don't know how long that document is when we're going to start building it. And that has a number of implications for InDesign. InDesign in particular likes having documents that are very understood where everything is. So we know how many pages they are. We know on page 1 it has exactly these elements. It has this exact X and Y coordinates. It has this exact height and width. Microsoft Word would be a good example of something that flows nicely. As you keep typing content into Microsoft Word, it keeps adding pages and adding pages and adding pages. InDesign doesn't work that way. And so in order to accommodate these things called variable length documents, which is a document that grows as you keep adding content to it, we built this concept of flows within PXM. And that is to say that as you add content, PXM will keep adding pages statically and linking those pages together as InDesign does it. So it's really emulating that process of building new pages and adding new content and linking them together, and building new pages and adding new content and linking them together. And it's automating a lot of that. So I'm going to switch over to our web browser and we're going to look at an example of a flow. So I have here our wonderful Jetstream example demo site. And within the examples for PXM on the SDN, there are two examples. One that we've seen, which is that Jetstream brochure. The second, we have what is the flight price list. And this actually has some components here on the page that allow you to select the number of months. So as we're picking flights for Jared to book, it's building this flight list. And so we can select either show me flights in November or show me flights in December and generate me a price list. Now this is also a bit of an interesting implementation from the point of view of a front end. Normally these things can run as Sitecore jobs in the background, which are asynchronous. So it's not something that the user has to wait for on the website. In fact, this can be generated in the background and sent, queued and sent to them as an email as these are built. In the case of this demonstration, it's just showing another example, which is building that PDF on the fly. The disadvantage is we have to wait for it to be built. Now, as I've been going through these demos, adding a lot of flights and booking a lot of prices, and so it's building these this very large repository as it builds it. And the point of all of this is when it finally builds that PDF, we're going to see a very large document, many pages, dozens of pages. And so we're going to open that and take a look at that. And here it is here. So you can see this is a 34-page document. And it's been built in a really actually clever implementation specifically for things like the table of contents and the index. And so we don't know how long this table of contents is. In this case, it's, a lot of pages, almost a dozen. And then we have the content itself. So flights between Logan and Venice, Logan and Milan, Toronto and Venice, etc., etc. So all the examples that we were showing. And basically this document structure is a bit of a template, and the flow just keeps adding content within that. It keeps building it out, keeps building it out, keeps building it out. So that was our example for November. Now we can go back and let's say we want to see November and December, and we're going to generate a price list. And instead of making a 34-page document, this is going to be 34 pages, which is November, plus 15 or so, which is December, and it's going to take a little bit longer. But the important thing that we're going to note is as we look through the document, we're again going to see all of those same elements that we saw for the November content. We're going to see a table of contents, we're going to see an index at the end, and we're going to see content flowing into that document. Now, the interesting thing and where flows come into play is this document, again, we don't know how long it's going to be. We don't know how many flights are in there, but we're using a flow to just continually flow the content within that. And the other thing that we're going to see and point out is I mentioned earlier that use of variables. In this case, the document has variables in place for that running header on the side. So if we're looking at November flights and prices, we're going to see that November header on that side of the page. If we then finally hit December, we're going to see December on that. And so that's using the headers within the master document on that page. Okay, so it's done generating, and I can open it up, and we see the price list again as well. And we can see here that it is now 39 pages, so it's added that. And so we have November here, we have our November flights, and this flow document just keeps adding content and adding content and adding content until somewhere at the end, we now see December, and that's that variable that was updated, and we're now having December content flow into that document. And that's how that was built. It's a pretty interesting example. So I'll show you where that is within the Jetstream PXM examples in InDesign and in Sitecore, and then we'll go about building a simple flow example ourselves from some simple flow content. Okay, so we're here in InDesign, and we're going to look at some of the characteristics within a PXM project and within the master document that enable a flow. Now, first things first, you'll notice that this is actually really only a 4-page document, and what we were loading was in fact a 34 or 39 page document, depending upon how much content we were flowing into it. And this is the reason is that in this case, the PXM project is receiving the month or months as a variable. And what we're loading in InDesign doesn't have that variable set. And this is important and at least useful for this demonstration because I don't want to have to wait for it to build me that 39-page document. I really just want to see and understand the structure within this. But of course, afterwards, if you do want to preview it and see actually what you're seeing in InDesign, you can set those variables and have it display that in the contents within InDesign, much like the Jetstream brochure. So a few things to look at here. We have our document and we have our structure for the table that's being built out for that ticketing information. So we have the basic structure is we have a front page, we have a table of contents, which is this page here, and we have X number of pages. We have a repeater which is repeating through the number of months. So this will build a page out for December and a page for November, and within December and November it will flow the content into that. So you might have this one page actually becoming 30 pages in the case of November, and that's what's going on there. You can see here this is using the D master within our master document. So if I click on that D master here, a number of things you can see. First of all, I'd mentioned the use of variables earlier. So this is a variable definition. If I look at my text variables and my defining of that RH month, table of contents, these are all things that are being used by the document to build out a running header of the month that we're displaying. So we're seeing text variables in use. We covered that a little bit. We could go into a lot more detail in a future video. Now, what we really want to see on this master is the fact that this is a very empty document with the exception of a layer called flow, and that layer has two text frames. You can see here the selection here of these two text frames. And those text frames are basically the definition of the content that is going to be flowed into that area on the screen. And so everything that you see in that final PDF output actually exists within a single text frame, and it's simply appending content and appending content and appending content into that text frame. And so PXM needs a few things. First of all, it needs the layer called flow, and it needs those layers to have a text frame for each page, and the content will be going into that text frame. The second thing PXM needs, and we actually need to go back to Sitecore for this, is within our price list and we look at the page, there's two things we need on the page. The first is to point it to that master document that has the flow reference, and you saw that, it's pointing to the D master. The second is this field of flow equals true, and that needs to be turned on. And then at this point, any content that you flow into a document now uses that text frame, and anything that's on the page, instead of using that static positioning of X and Y, width and height, all the stuff that InDesign normally expects, it simply forces that into that static text frame and starts flowing content linearly. So you lose a lot of the advantages of absolute positioning, but you gain the advantages of the fact that you don't necessarily need to keep building a document and adding stuff manually because the flow will do it for you. Now what that does is that introduces a new language of positioning, and the same way we saw the inline anchored elements earlier, placing the stars and the dollar sign symbols for the pricing and the rating of a hotel, you then in a flow, because you're always working in a single text frame, you need to start moving from absolute positioning to relative positioning using inlines. And that of course is what this document does. So as it's building out these tables, it simply keeps adding content and using that relative positioning of this inline and of this table information that continues to flow through that text frame. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit about how that price list flow document was built, and it's a very complex document, there's a lot going on, a lot of custom renderers for things like repeaters, custom renderers for getting and setting variables, It's calling the project on the fly, passing it data. It's a pretty complex implementation, and it's an excellent example, and a lot of clients who have built out flows really use this document as a starting point, because it does cover pretty much all the things that you'll need to do from the perspective of building out a flow document. Now that said, because it's a complex document, it's not necessarily the best learning example to start with. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to run through a bit of a demonstration, and this is based upon content from a blog post that I did fairly recently. So we're basically going to add a new spread to a document. We're going to create some flow layers within that spread, and then we're going to take the existing Jetstream brochure, which is to say this document here and all the content that goes on the page and all of the static positioning, and we're going to change that to a flow and basically go to this style of document. And you'll see that all of our absolute positioning information gets lost, and instead it gets flowed into that. But then I can show the advantage is that if you have, instead of 5 content blocks, which on this page you need absolutely 5, no more, no less. If you have 6, the document doesn't work. But in the case of this flow, if you have 6, it will just simply add it. If you have 60, it will simply build out 10 more pages to accommodate that. So we're going to take this example. Again, it's here on sitecore.net under my blog, and we're going to take that and we're going to actually build out this example from start to finish. So step 1 in adding a flow is to add changes to the master document in order to accommodate the text frame and information flowing into that. So first things first, we're going to take the existing Jetstream brochure flow and we're going to load it in InDesign and take a look at our pages here. And so you can see we've got the 3 spreads that we were familiar with before: the front page, the middle pages, and the last page. So we're going to make a new master and call it the D master. And within that, I'm going to make a new layer and call it flow. And I will make the color something really noticeable, like yellow. And then within this flow layer, I'm going to create 2 text frames. And this is really the content that will be going into this document. So I'm going to set this a little bit in from the margins and then add that on page 2 as well and snap that into the center. So that shocking yellow color, you can now see here that my flows, my text frames exist within that flow layer, and they exist on that document. So next step, I don't want to save this over the existing master. You can, in that this is a new spread. It wouldn't conflict in any way with the existing document, but often I give demos regularly and I'm constantly creating and deleting these things. So I'm going to make a new master document, call it brochure flow, and say OK. So that is step 1. Step 2 is to take the existing Jetstream brochure PXM project and make a duplicate of it. I'm going to call this Jetstream brochure flow. I'm going to change the display name as well to be in sync. And there's 2 things that I need to do on this document. The first is I want to change the master document that I'm using. So right now it uses existing brochure master letter. I want to use brochure flow. You can set this within InDesign. We saw that it's a drag and drop operation, or you can set it here in Sitecore. I'm just doing it here in Sitecore because there's a number of other changes I need to do here. Second is I want that flow to be on page 3. So again, I'll go to page 3 and I'm going to change this prefix from master B, which is this spread that we saw earlier, to master D. I want to be able to use that flow spread, so I'll change that. And then the last thing is to say flow equals true. And so that's it. So 3 steps. First of all, within your master document, add a new spread, add a flow layer, have text frames within that flow layer. The content will flow into those text frames. That's step 1. And step 2 is create or modify an existing PXM project. So we've done that already. And so I've got my Jetstream brochure flow. So I'm going to load that, and then you can see here I'm using the correct master document, that new master document we created, brochure flow, and on page 3 I'm now referring to that D master. All these things really just need to line up. And so I can close that master document, and now if I load this, and that creates a PDF. And we click on the D document. And it's applying a little bit of the formatting information from B. It's actually spreading over and spilling over to the D document. But that's not what we're concerned with. I'm actually going to set this to D just to clear that out for now. But you can see here what was previously a very heavily formatted document. There was a lot of static positioning and static placement. Now you lose all of that static positioning and placement, and everything is now placed linearly in this flow. The advantage of this, now if I go back to Sitecore, I can make copies of all these elements. So, you know, duplicate, duplicate. I'm going to make a few of these. I'm going to make enough that we're going to hit, 2 pages. Duplicate. And I'm going to delete page 2 because that was causing me some formatting issues. So, Venice Gondola. So I should now have enough content that we're going to hit 2 pages in our flow. I'm going to go back to InDesign. I'm going to close this. Often you can simply refresh the contents of a single page, but because we're doing modifications that span multiple pages, it's best just to simply close the document, refresh it, and reload it. And so we can see here, here's all of that content. So we hit enough that it filled up 1 page, and then the flow created a 2nd page, and if we had more and more content, it would just keep creating pages. As per the spread, it would keep creating them as left and right pages, on and on continuously. Now that's the basics of the flow. In practice, what this means is because you've lost a lot of the static positioning information, you need to start doing things like inline positioning or tables in order to build out something that looks good and clean on a repetitive level. There'll be another video covering that, but really what we wanted to do for this video is a simple introduction to flows to make it clear that this is something that PXM can handle, and here's how you get started with that. The last topic we're going to cover today is that of document structure and its implications on document automation. So, like a lot of things in Sitecore development, there's a number of ways that you can do any given problem. And by knowing a little bit about InDesign, you can negate the necessity to do a lot of these changes in code. So we're going to look at a really simple example and a few simple things that you can do to text frames and how something is structured in the InDesign document itself, meaning that you don't have to code to deal with those use cases. Okay, so we're here in InDesign, and I have a bit of design that was given to me by a client, and there's a few things to note here. And what we're looking at is essentially an event listening, and what they're going to do is automate this so that depending upon the number of events in a given day, this text frame could either shrink or grow. Now, looking at this, if this was given to a print designer, they could very easily integrate new events and put them on the page and move around what they needed to move around. So, for example here, let's say we have another event. So we're going to copy this event and paste it. And what we'll see is, oh goodness, this event is overset text. It's taking up more room than the text frame actually has. So then they have to take this text frame, the bounding box, drag it down, drag this one down, drag this one down. Well, let's say they have 2 events. Okay, then we need to add some to the left-hand side and add some to the right-hand side. And it's a fairly quick thing to do if you're a designer here in InDesign, but it's obviously a difficult thing to automate. And if this is something that you're doing on a daily basis, and for this client this was happening in multiple locations every single day, they would have different event listings, and so it was a fairly time-consuming document process where a designer would have to open up a document, insert a whole bunch of content, and do a lot of very small tweaks to this document that would add up a lot over time. Now, this is a document that or a structure within a document that can actually be changed or reworked slightly so that things are a lot easier for the designer. And of course, when we automate this document, things are a lot easier for that document automated output as well. So a few things. One, this is actually 3 text frames. We have a text frame here, a text frame here, and a text frame here. And realistically speaking, this could just be 1 text frame. So that's the first problem. And by reducing these 3 text frames to 1 text frame, it means that you can use things like auto fit options to make this text frame shrink or grow as necessary as you add more content into that. So that's one of the nice things about InDesign. Secondly, these text frames aren't linked to each other. So, I was talking about, well, if we needed to add more events and more events, you can't just always put them here in this right column. You'd need to put some in the left column as well, and you'd always have to continuously balance that out. Well, the obvious solution in InDesign is to link those paragraphs. So we now have these linked paragraphs here. However, by linking those paragraphs, you can see that we've introduced another problem into this design as well, and that is this orphan text here. So we have, as we added a new event, half of the event is here in this left-hand side, half of the event here is in this right-hand side. And that's really, again, one of those things that a designer is going to have to go through and say, oh, right, I'm going to hit enter and manually tweak that to make it work. Again, it's unnecessary because you can use InDesign to make those changes and really have InDesign do the work for you. So let's look at another page here. This is page 2. And page 2 has exactly all the changes that we want. And there's a few things here. First of all, instead of having individual events just simply flowing into these text frames, we've linked these individual events within anchored elements, within inlines. And the reason is because as you can add events here, it will always keep those events in the proper columns. So if I add some more text and start making this event larger and start making it larger, and if I have this set to auto grow, it will start forcing this down. But then the minute it forces the next paragraph down, it just moves it onto the next column. So that way we're keeping each individual event together. And there's 2 ways to do that. One, you can either use inlines as we have here, or second, there's a property in paragraph styles called keep with next. And basically that allows you to define a paragraph style, and so you can say, right, for my header paragraph I want to keep it with the next lines, or for my other text I want to keep it with the previous lines. And so you can use paragraph styles to keep specific text elements together, or you can use inlines. And so in this case here we're using inlines to basically ensure that a bit of text moves as a group. And so you see here, the minute I delete those events, this text frame starts shrinking. Things start snapping back into place. So I can do this one more time. I'll delete this event. And so this text frame is shrinking to accommodate the smaller amount of text. I'm going to keep going. So just keep shrinking. And that is a property of text frame options called auto size. And so this is the other thing we've done, is we've set auto size on this text frame such that the minute you remove content or add content, the text frame grows to accommodate that. The designer doesn't have to manually click and drag and make this bigger. So that's the second change that we've done. And the third change that we've done is on the text frame properties in general. Instead of having 3 text frames as we did before on the previous page, we have set the text frame options on the single text frame to have 2 columns within that and to have some spacing and gutter as well. So basically, we've achieved the same layout, but within a single text frame, which means that we can start to do some document automation. And again, the moment you start adding content or removing content, this text frame will shrink and grow to accommodate that. And then lastly, of course, we have text wrap options on this banner on top. So again, it's a single text frame here, but we have turned wrap on. Therefore, this banner can push the text below it downwards, again, achieving that same layout, but by using clever tricks within InDesign. So these are the types of things that are really common strategies for building out a document, so that those little tweaks that designers do on a regular basis, adding white space, balancing content between different columns, manually dragging columns around and the size of text frames around. These are things that can be automated using out-of-the-box features within Adobe InDesign. So, in summary, those are the basic features and benefits of InDesign that you need to know as a Sitecore developer. So, master documents, text handling, and of course, a little bit of understanding of InDesign. You don't necessarily need to be a designer, but to be able to speak to a designer in their terms and know how you can change and alter a document for the benefit of both of you is a pretty key skill in building out PXM projects. For more information about working with PXM, you can visit my blog on sitecore.net. I'm in the Learning and Technical Blogs section. There's a lot of videos, example code, and other implementation information here. Secondly, the examples that I've been using come from the Adaptive Print Studio solution cases on the Sitecore Developer Network. Adaptive Print Studio is, of course, the old name for the product, Print Experience Manager now. However, a lot of the information on SDN is filed under the old name. So if you look at Adaptive Print Studio 1.4 and the Adaptive Print Studio solution cases, a lot of the Jetstream examples that we were working with can be downloaded from here. If you're a Sitecore partner, you have access to Jetstream through the SPN. If you're a Sitecore customer or potential customer, contact your account representative and they'll get you access to the product.